I never thought I would break down crying over a crumpled pharmacy receipt. But when I saw it lying there on my cluttered kitchen counter in our small Queens apartment, next to an empty coffee cup and a forgotten grocery list, I felt my entire world collapse into silence. That receipt wasn't just paper. It was a sign that everything I believed about my family was unraveling. Today I'm going to tell you something I never thought I would share. And if for even a second this feels familiar, I only ask that you like this video and subscribe. It will help me keep opening my heart. My name is Margaret, and I'm 72 years old. Every morning I wake up before the city noise breaks through my window in my worn, creaky apartment overlooking Roosevelt Avenue. The paint on the walls has yellowed over the years, and the hardwood floors creak with every step I take. But this place has been my home for 35 years, through marriages and divorces, births and heartaches, dreams and disappointments. I spend my days managing my son's household, cooking meals nobody seems to appreciate anymore, and caring for my 8-year-old granddaughter Sophie as if I'm the only one who remembers what unconditional love actually means. The hum of the number 7 train overhead, the distant honk of car horns, the chatter of street vendors selling fresh fruit, it all blends into a background I've grown almost numb to over the decades. My daily routine had become as predictable as clockwork. Wake up at 5:30, make coffee in the same chipped mug I've used for 15 years, check if Daniel, my son, had left any notes about Sophie's schedule, prepare breakfast that usually went half-eaten, clean up the mess left behind by people who seemed to take my presence for granted. But that Tuesday morning in September was different. I was just getting through the motions when I spotted something that made my blood run cold. A pharmacy receipt tucked beside the grocery list I'd written the night before. At first glance, it looked innocent enough, just another piece of paper in the endless stream of bills and reminders that cluttered our kitchen counter. But as I picked it up, my reading glasses sliding down my nose, the words became clear. Misoprostol, mifepristone, names I recognized from my younger years working as a nurse's aide, back when I had dreams of my own before I gave everything up to raise my family. These weren't medications for a headache or a cold. These were abortion pills. My hands started trembling. The handwriting was unmistakably Lisa's, my daughter-in-law's careful script that I'd seen on birthday cards and grocery lists for the past 8 years. Lisa, who was supposed to be 4 months pregnant with the grandchild I'd been secretly knitting blankets for in the evenings when nobody else was around. The receipt was dated just 3 days ago. 3 days ago, while I was babysitting Sophie and preparing dinner, while I was asking Lisa how she was feeling and if she needed anything for the baby, while I was planning a surprise baby shower in my head. 3 days ago, she was at a pharmacy picking up pills to end the pregnancy I thought we were all celebrating. I sank into the old wooden chair by the window, the one that used to be my mother's, and stared at that piece of paper until the words blurred together. My heart was racing, but my mind felt strangely empty, like stepping into a room and suddenly forgetting why you came there in the first place. The memories came flooding back then, hitting me like waves against a seawall. Lisa's pale face at our last family dinner 3 weeks ago, how she'd barely touched her food and kept avoiding my eyes when I asked about doctor appointments. The way she'd been wearing loose, flowing clothes even though September in Queens was still warm enough for lighter fabrics. The canceled appointments with the midwife she claimed she'd forgotten about. I remembered those tiny yellow baby shoes I'd bought on impulse at the Target in Elmhurst, hidden away in my bedroom dresser next to the half-finished blanket. The bottle of baby lotion I'd purchased weeks ago sitting unopened on the bathroom shelf, its familiar powder-fresh scent still clinging to the air whenever I walked past. Now it all made terrible, heartbreaking sense. The secrecy, the distance, the way Daniel had been avoiding conversations about baby names and nursery preparations. They'd made this decision together, and they'd kept me completely in the dark, treating me like some outsider who couldn't be trusted with their family secrets. But why? Why couldn't they tell me? Was I so judgmental, so difficult to talk to that they felt they had to hide something this important from me? Or was I just so irrelevant to their lives that my feelings didn't matter enough to consider? I sat there in my kitchen, surrounded by the sounds of Queens waking up around me, cars honking on Roosevelt Avenue, children laughing on their way to school, the familiar rumble of subway trains, and I felt more alone than I had in years. The receipt lay on the table in front of me, A small piece of paper that had managed to shatter everything I thought I knew about my place in this family I'd given my entire life to protect and nurture. You see, I've never been the type to hold grudges easily. Maybe that's been my problem all along. For the past 25 years, since Daniel was just a teenager struggling with his father's abandonment, I've given my family everything I had to give and then found ways to give more. I gave up my dream of finishing my nursing degree at York College when Daniel needed help with his tuition at Queen's College. The money I'd saved working double shifts at 2 different jobs, cleaning offices in Manhattan during the day, and stocking shelves at the grocery store on Northern Boulevard at night. All of it went toward his education, his wedding, his down payment on the apartment they live in now in Astoria. When Lisa got pregnant the first time with Sophie, I was the one holding her hand through morning sickness, driving her to appointments when Daniel was working late, teaching her how to change diapers and warm bottles at 2 in the morning. I was the one who moved in with them for 3 months after Sophie was born, sleeping on their uncomfortable pull-out couch, getting up every few hours to help with feeding so Lisa could rest. "You'll understand one day, Mom," Daniel would tell me when I looked exhausted from juggling all my responsibilities. "Family takes care of family. That's what you taught me." And I believed him. I wanted to believe him. When he'd call me at the last minute, "Mom, can you watch Sophie again? We've got this important client meeting." I'd see the stress in his eyes, the weight of providing for his family, and I'd nod and smile and cancel whatever small plans I might have had for myself. But somewhere along the way, those grateful smiles became expectant nods. Those, "Thank you so much, Mom," became, "You don't mind, do you?" And then they just stopped asking altogether, assuming I'd always be available, always willing, always putting their needs before my own. My daughter-in-law Lisa and I had what you might generously call a complicated relationship. She was polite enough, never outright rude or disrespectful, but there was a distance there, a coolness that I could never quite bridge no matter how hard I tried. I'd make her favorite tea, chamomile with honey, and she'd accept it with a mumbled thanks while scrolling through her phone. I'd ask about her day, her work at the dental office, her friends, and I'd get one-word answers that effectively ended any chance of real conversation. During family dinners, I often felt like furniture in my own son's home. They'd talk around me, over me, about me as if I wasn't sitting right there at the table I'd helped them buy. Plans would be made, decisions would be discussed, and I'd learn about them secondhand or sometimes not at all. Late at night, lying in my single bed in my Queen's apartment, I'd whisper to myself the question that scared me most. Maybe I'm being used. The thought would creep in during quiet moments, when I was folding Daniel's laundry or preparing meals they'd barely acknowledge, when I was spending my limited Social Security money on groceries for their household, or gifts for Sophie that would be forgotten in a pile of other toys. But I'd push those thoughts away as quickly as they came. Family was family. Love meant sacrifice. This was what mothers did, what grandmothers did. We gave and gave and gave because that's what love looked like, even when it left us empty and invisible. Now, holding that pharmacy receipt in my shaking hands, I realized that all those little acts of selflessness, all those sacrifices I'd convinced myself were expressions of love, might have been nothing more than convenient arrangements for people who saw me as a resource rather than a person. The small wounds had been accumulating for years, tiny cuts that I'd bandaged with excuses and rationalization, forgotten birthdays where I'd convinced myself they were just busy, unreturned phone calls that I'd told myself were due to their hectic schedules, illnesses that went unnoticed and unacknowledged, because I'd taught them that my suffering didn't matter as much as their convenience. I remember last winter when I caught the worst flu I'd had in years. I was running a fever of 102, could barely get out of bed, and had run out of soup and medicine. I called Daniel, hoping he might stop by with some groceries or at least check to see how I was doing. His response was a text message. "Mom, take care of yourself. We're swamped at work this week." No visit, no phone call to see if I was getting better, no offer to pick up medicine or food. Just a dismissive text that made me feel like a burden for even asking. I spent 3 days alone in my apartment, surviving on crackers and water, too weak to make it to the store, telling myself they were just busy and didn't realize how sick I actually was. When I finally recovered and saw them the following week, neither Daniel nor Lisa even asked how I was feeling. It was as if those 3 days of misery had never happened, as if my suffering was so unimportant that it didn't warrant even casual inquiry. But I swallowed the hurt, just like I always did. I smiled and nodded and asked them how their week had been, how work was going, whether Sophie needed anything for school. I performed the role of the caring mother and grandmother, while slowly dying inside from all the care I never received in return. And now this receipt. This final devastating proof that I wasn't just overlooked or taken for granted. I was actively excluded from the most important decisions in their lives. They trusted me to babysit and cook and clean and sacrifice, but they didn't trust me enough to share their struggles, their fears, their need for support during what must have been an incredibly difficult time. I don't know how long I sat at that kitchen table, staring at those medication names and trying to process what they meant. The morning sounds outside my window gradually gave way to the bustle of midday. School children walking home for lunch, delivery trucks rumbling down Roosevelt Avenue, the constant rhythm of city life that had been the soundtrack to all my years of quiet suffering. Finally, I stood up on unsteady legs and walked to my bedroom, the receipt still clutched in my hand like evidence of a crime. I opened the drawer of my old dresser, the same one that had belonged to my mother, who'd raised 5 children during the Depression without ever complaining about the sacrifices she had to make. Inside that drawer were the baby shoes, still in their little box with the price tag attached. Next to them, folded carefully in tissue paper, was the blanket I'd been knitting in soft green yarn, gender neutral, because Lisa and Daniel had wanted to be surprised. I'd spent dozens of evenings working on that blanket, imagining the grandchild I thought was coming, planning all the ways I'd spoil and love another little person who might actually appreciate my presence in their life. I picked up those tiny shoes and held them against my chest, and for the first time in years, I let myself cry. Really cry. Not the quiet, suppressed tears I'd grown accustomed to, but deep, body-shaking sobs that came from a place of pain I'd been carrying for so long I'd almost forgotten it was there. The sound echoed in my small bedroom, mixing with the distant noise of the city outside. I cried for the grandchild who would never wear those shoes, for the daughter-in-law who couldn't trust me with her struggles, for the son who'd learned to take my love for granted, and mostly for myself, for all the years I'd spent believing that making myself smaller would somehow make my family's lives bigger and better. When the tears finally stopped, I felt something I hadn't experienced in decades. Not relief exactly, but a kind of clarity that comes after a storm has passed and you can finally see the landscape clearly for the first time. The receipt was still in my other hand, but it no longer felt like a weapon aimed at my heart. It felt like information, data, a piece of the puzzle that helped explain why I'd been feeling so lost and invisible in my own family for so long. I walked back to the kitchen, placed the receipt on the counter exactly where I'd found it, and began to consider something I'd never seriously contemplated before. What would happen if I stopped pretending that this one-sided relationship was sustainable? What would happen if I stopped accepting crumbs of affection and started demanding the basic respect that any human being deserves from the people they love most? The thought terrified me. But for the first time in years, it also excited me just a little bit. What would it feel like to matter to someone? What would it feel like to be included rather than used? What would it feel like to be seen as a whole person rather than just a convenient solution to other people's problems? I spent the rest of that day in a strange state of suspended animation, going through the motions of my normal routine, while my mind processed everything I'd learned and everything I'd been willfully ignoring for too long. I prepared dinner for Sophie when she got home from school, helped her with homework, listened to her chatter about friends and teachers with the kind of attention I wished someone would give to my own thoughts and feelings. But when Daniel and Lisa came home that evening, I watched them with different eyes. I noticed how they moved around me rather than toward me, how their greetings were perfunctory rather than warm, how they discussed their day with each other while I cleaned up the dinner dishes and organized Sophie's backpack for the next day. I noticed how Lisa's face looked strained and tired, how she kept touching her stomach in a way that spoke of loss rather than expectation. I wondered how long she'd been carrying this burden alone, how frightened she must have been, how much pain she was in that she felt she couldn't share with the one person in the family who'd experienced the full spectrum of maternal joy and sorrow. But mostly, I noticed how invisible I felt in that apartment that I'd helped them afford, surrounded by people I'd devoted my entire adult life to loving and supporting. I was the ghost of constant service, present but not really seen, necessary but not appreciated, loved in theory but ignored in practice. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, I sat in my kitchen with a cup of tea and that pharmacy receipt, and I made a decision that would change everything. I was going to have a conversation with my son. I was going to ask the questions I'd been too afraid to ask for years. I was going to find out whether there was any space in this family for me as a person, rather than just a function. I was going to risk everything I'd built with them in order to find out if any of it was real. The next morning, I woke up with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in decades. The familiar sounds of the city stirring to life outside my window, garbage trucks rumbling down Roosevelt Avenue, early commuters rushing to catch the subway, vendors setting up their fruit stands, seemed sharper, more vivid, as if I was hearing them clearly for the first time in years. I made my coffee in the same chipped mug, but instead of immediately beginning my routine of preparation and service, I sat at the kitchen table and waited. I waited for Daniel to wake up and come looking for the breakfast I usually had ready. I waited for Lisa to emerge from their bedroom, pale and quiet as she'd been for weeks. I waited for Sophie to bound into the kitchen looking for the lunch I always packed for her school day. When Daniel finally appeared, hair disheveled and checking his phone before he'd even said good morning, he paused when he saw me sitting empty-handed at the table. "Mom, you okay? Where's breakfast?" His tone was casual, almost irritated, as if my failure to perform my expected role was an inconvenience rather than an opportunity to check on my well-being. I looked at my son, really looked at him, and saw a man I barely recognized. When had he become someone who expected service rather than offering connection? When had I become someone whose value was measured entirely by what I could provide rather than who I was as a person? "Daniel, we need to talk." My voice sounded strange to my own ears, steady and calm in a way I hadn't heard in years. He glanced at his watch, that familiar gesture that meant he was already calculating how much time he could spare for whatever I needed to discuss. "Can it wait until tonight, Mom? I've got that big presentation today, and Lisa's still not feeling great, and Sophie needs to get to school early for her science project setup." "No," I said quietly. "It can't wait." Something in my tone must have gotten through to him because he actually looked at me instead of through me for the first time in months. He saw the pharmacy receipt in my hands, and I watched his face change from casual dismissal to shock to something that looked almost like panic. "Mom, I can explain. Can you?" I held up the receipt, this small piece of paper that had blown apart everything I thought I knew about my place in this family. Because I've been trying to understand this for 24 hours now, and I can't seem to make sense of why you and Lisa felt you couldn't trust me with something this important. Lisa appeared in the doorway then, drawn by the unusual sound of serious conversation in our kitchen. When she saw the receipt in my hands, she went completely white and grabbed the doorframe for support. "Daniel told me you were 4 months pregnant," I continued, my voice still remarkably steady. "I've been knitting blankets. I bought baby shoes. I've been planning a shower and thinking about how wonderful it would be to have another grandchild to love. But this receipt tells a different story, doesn't it?" The silence in that small kitchen was deafening. Even the city sounds outside seemed muted, as if the whole world was holding its breath waiting to see what would happen next. Daniel sat down heavily in the chair across from me, and for the first time in years, I saw him not as my son who could do no wrong, not as the successful man I'd sacrificed everything to help create, but as a flawed human being who was about to try to justify excluding me from one of the most significant decisions of his adult life. "Mom, you don't understand how complicated this whole situation is," he began, running his hands through his hair in a gesture I remembered from his adolescence. "Lisa's been having problems with the pregnancy, medical issues. The doctors said there might be complications, that the baby might not be healthy, that Lisa could be at risk if she continued." I turned to look at Lisa, who was still standing in the doorway looking like she wanted to disappear entirely. "Is that true?" I asked her directly. She opened her mouth, closed it again, then finally whispered, "It's complicated, Margaret." Complicated how? Are you saying that everything Daniel just told me is accurate? Or are there other reasons you decided to end the pregnancy? Reasons that you both felt I couldn't be trusted to understand or support you through? The questions hung in the air like smoke, and I realized I was asking not just about the pregnancy, but about my entire relationship with these people I'd centered my life around. How many other complicated decisions had they made without consulting me? How many times had they decided I was too old, too traditional, too something to be included in their real lives? Daniel looked at Lisa, some kind of silent communication passing between them that excluded me completely, just like every other important conversation they'd ever had. "The truth is," Daniel said finally, "we couldn't afford another child right now. Lisa's job at the dental office doesn't offer maternity leave, and my income alone isn't enough to cover childcare for 2 kids, plus all our other expenses. We're already struggling to pay for Sophie's activities and save for her college fund. Another baby would have meant Lisa couldn't work for months, maybe longer, and we would have lost the apartment." I absorbed this information slowly, feeling pieces of a puzzle clicking into place. "So you made the decision based on money." "It's not that simple, Mom," Lisa spoke up for the first time, her voice barely above a whisper. "We talked about it for weeks. We looked at our budget over and over again. We considered every possibility. This wasn't something we decided lightly. But you never considered talking to me about it? Never thought that maybe your family might be able to help you find solutions, offer support, figure out a way to make it work if that's what you wanted?" Another silence. Another exchange of glances that didn't include me. "Mom," Daniel said carefully, "you're already doing so much for us. You babysit Sophie all the time. You help with groceries. You've given us money when we needed it. We couldn't ask you to take on even more responsibility. It wouldn't be fair to you." The irony of his words hit me like a physical blow. They couldn't ask me to help with their real problems because it wouldn't be fair to me. But they had no problem asking me to sacrifice my time, money, and emotional energy for everything else. They could take my service, but not my support. They could accept my labor, but not my love. So instead, you decided to handle it yourselves and keep me in the dark while I planned baby showers and bought gifts for a grandchild that was never going to exist. "Oh, we didn't know how to tell you," Lisa said, tears starting to run down her cheeks. "You were so excited about the pregnancy. You started talking about names and buying baby things the minute we told you. We knew you'd be heartbroken, and we didn't want to put you through that pain when there was nothing you could do to change our decision anyway." "Nothing I could do." I stood up from the table, the receipt still clutched in my trembling hands. "Nothing I could do? Lisa, I raised 3 children as a single mother after your father-in-law abandoned us. I worked 2 jobs while Daniel was in school and still managed to keep food on the table and clothes on his back. I've been managing tight budgets and impossible situations for 40 years, but you decided there was nothing I could do to help you figure out how to manage one more child?" I looked between my son and daughter-in-law, these 2 people I'd opened my heart and home to, and felt something fundamental shift inside me. They hadn't kept this secret to protect me from pain. They'd kept it to protect themselves from having to consider my input, my feelings, my potential solutions. They'd made their decision in a vacuum and left me to live in a fantasy world of my own construction, knitting blankets for a baby that would never exist. "The real truth," I said, my voice gaining strength with each word, "is that you didn't want my opinion because you were afraid I might complicate your decision. You didn't want to risk that I might offer help that would make it harder for you to choose the easiest path. You wanted to make your choice and then deal with the consequences without having to consider how it would affect anyone else." "Mom, that's not fair." Daniel started to protest. "Isn't it?" I interrupted. "When have either of you ever asked what's fair to me? When have you considered whether it's fair to expect me to babysit every time you need a night out? When have you wondered whether it's fair to assume I'll always be available to cook and clean and provide free childcare without ever asking if I have plans of my own? When have you questioned whether it's fair to take my money and my time and my love and give me nothing but polite distance in return?" The kitchen fell silent again. But this time it felt different. This time, instead of feeling invisible, I felt like the most present person in the room. All those years of swallowing my words, suppressing my needs, minimizing my feelings to make space for theirs. Suddenly, I was taking up space, demanding acknowledgement, refusing to disappear. Sophie chose that moment to wander into the kitchen, rubbing her eyes and looking for breakfast. The sight of her innocence in the middle of all this adult pain reminded me of what was really at stake. This wasn't just about Daniel and Lisa's decision about their pregnancy. This was about the kind of family we were going to be, the kind of relationships we were going to model for the next generation. Grandma Margaret? Sophie looked up at me with those bright 8-year-old eyes that saw everything and understood more than the adults gave her credit for. Why is everyone sad? I knelt down to her level and smoothed her hair. This child who was the one bright spot in all the family dysfunction, the one person who seemed to genuinely enjoy my company and appreciate my presence in her life. We're having a grown-up conversation about some difficult things, sweetheart, but everything's going to be okay. I hoped that was true. I hoped that what I was about to do would ultimately make things better, rather than destroying what little family connection I had left. I stood back up and looked at Daniel and Lisa, who were both watching me with a mixture of fear and defiance, clearly hoping this conversation would end without requiring any real change in how our family operated. Here's what's going to happen, I said, my voice calm but unmistakably firm. I'm going to finish making breakfast for Sophie because she needs to eat before school. You two are going to sit here and think about whether you want to have an honest conversation about how this family functions, or whether you prefer to continue pretending that I'm nothing more than a convenient service provider who doesn't deserve basic respect and inclusion. I turned my back on them and began preparing Sophie's breakfast, but my hands were shaking as I poured cereal and sliced fruit. I'd never spoken to my son that way in his entire life. I'd never demanded anything from either of them beyond basic politeness. I'd certainly never threatened to change the fundamental dynamic of our relationship. But holding that pharmacy receipt had shown me something I'd been refusing to see for years. This wasn't love I was receiving from them. It was exploitation dressed up in family obligations. They took what they needed from me and gave back just enough courtesy to keep me available for the next request. Real love would have included me in their struggle. Real love would have trusted me with their difficult decision, even if they ultimately chose not to take my advice. Real love would have seen me as a person whose feelings mattered, whose wisdom might be valuable, whose support might make an impossible situation more manageable. Instead, they'd treated me like a child who needed to be protected from reality, or worse, like a burden who would only complicate their lives if I knew what was actually happening. As I packed Sophie's lunch and helped her gather her school supplies, I could feel Daniel and Lisa watching me, waiting to see if this unusual moment of assertiveness would pass, and I'd return to my familiar role as their silent, compliant helper. But something had changed in me overnight. That pharmacy receipt had been the final straw, but now I could see it was just the latest in a decades-long pattern of exclusion and exploitation. I'd been so afraid of losing my family that I'd allowed them to treat me as if I wasn't really part of it in the first place. After Sophie left for school with her father, a routine I usually handled myself, I found myself alone in the kitchen with Lisa. She stood by the window looking out at Roosevelt Avenue, her arms wrapped around herself as if she was cold despite the warm September morning. "Lisa," I said gently, "I want you to know that I'm not angry about your decision regarding the pregnancy. That was your choice to make, and I respect that completely. What breaks my heart is that you didn't trust me enough to let me support you through it." She turned to face me, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Margaret, I wanted to tell you. There were so many nights I almost called you because I was so scared and confused and I didn't know what to do. But Daniel said you'd try to talk us out of it, that you'd make it harder than it already was. And what do you think? Do you think I would have judgmental or unsupportive? I don't know," she admitted. "We don't really talk about personal things, do we? I mean, we're friendly enough, but we don't have the kind of relationship where I'd feel comfortable sharing my deepest fears and struggles. I wasn't sure how you'd react." Her honesty was like a knife to my heart, but it was also a gift. She was finally telling me the truth about how distant our relationship had become, how I'd failed to create the kind of environment where she'd feel safe being vulnerable with me. "You're right," I said. We don't have that kind of relationship. But Lisa, I've been longing for that kind of relationship with you for 8 years. Every time I've tried to get closer, you've pulled away. Every time I've asked personal questions or tried to offer emotional support, you've given me polite but distant responses. I started to think you just didn't like me very much. It's not that I don't like you, she said quietly. It's just that you're so perfect. You've managed to raise Daniel and his siblings as a single mother. You're always put together and competent. You never seem to struggle with anything. I felt like if I showed you how much I was struggling, you'd think I was weak or inadequate. I stared at her in amazement. Perfect? Lisa, I feel like I'm failing at everything, all the time. I feel invisible in this family. I feel taken for granted and excluded from everything important. I spend most days wondering if anyone would even notice if I disappeared. For the first time in all the years I'd known her, Lisa really looked at me. Not past me or around me, but directly at me, as if she was seeing a person instead of a convenient grandmother-shaped service provider. I had no idea you felt that way, she whispered. How could you know? We never talk about anything real. We never share our actual feelings or struggles. We just perform our roles, you as the polite daughter-in-law, me as the helpful mother-in-law, and pretend that surface-level pleasantness is the same thing as genuine relationship. We stood there in my small kitchen, two women who'd been living parallel lives for nearly a decade, finally seeing each other clearly for the first time. I realized that while I'd been feeling excluded and taken for granted, Lisa had been feeling judged and inadequate. While I'd been desperate for deeper connection, she'd been protecting herself from what she perceived as my impossibly high standards. Lisa, I said carefully, I need you to know that I've never expected perfection from you. I've never judged you for struggling. The reason I've tried so hard to help with Sophie and household things isn't because I think you're incapable. It's because I love you both and I want to contribute something meaningful to this family. But you're always so calm and competent about everything. When Sophie has a meltdown, you handle it perfectly. When we run out of groceries, you just quietly take care of it. When we need someone to cover our responsibilities, you never complain or act like it's an inconvenience. That's because I'm grateful to be needed, I admitted. I'm grateful to have a purpose in your lives. But Lisa, being useful isn't the same thing as being valued. Being helpful isn't the same thing as being loved. I need to know that I matter to you as a person, not just as a solution to your childcare and household management problems. She was quiet for a long moment, absorbing what I'd said. Then she asked, What do you need from us? What would make you feel more valued and included? The question caught me off guard because nobody had asked me what I needed in so long that I'd almost forgotten I was allowed to have needs of my own. I need to be included in important decisions, even when you ultimately choose not to follow my advice. I need to know that my feelings and opinions matter enough to be considered. I need conversations that go deeper than discussing Sophie's school schedule and what groceries we need. I need to feel like I'm part of this family, not just employed by it. Margaret, Lisa said, fresh tears starting to fall. I'm so sorry. I had no idea we were making you feel that way. I thought we were protecting your feelings by not burdening you with our problems. I thought we were being considerate by not asking even more of you than we already do. But don't you see? By protecting me from your problems, you were protecting yourselves from having to consider my input or deal with my emotional reactions. By not burdening me with your struggles, you were denying me the opportunity to offer the kind of support that actually matters. You were treating me like a fragile stranger instead of like family. I could see her processing this, trying to reconcile what I was saying with years of assumptions about our relationship and my role in their lives. When Daniel and I were trying to decide what to do about the pregnancy, she said slowly, we talked about money and logistics and timing, but we never talked about family support because we never considered that you might want to help with something that difficult. We thought of you as someone we needed to protect from bad news, not someone we could rely on for emotional or practical support during a crisis. And that's exactly the problem, I replied. You've categorized me as someone who provides services, but doesn't deserve to share in the real substance of your lives. I'm good enough to babysit and cook and clean, but not good enough to trust with your fears and struggles and important decisions. Lisa sank into the chair Daniel had vacated, looking exhausted by the weight of this conversation, and everything it was revealing about how broken our family dynamics had become. "I don't know how to fix this," she said. "I don't know how to have the kind of relationship with you that we should have had all along. We start by being honest with each other," I said. "We start by sharing real things instead of just going through the motions of polite family interactions. We start by treating each other like whole people instead of just filling the roles we think we're supposed to play." I sat down across from her at the table where I'd spent so many mornings in silent service, and for the first time, it felt like we were finally going to have a real conversation. "Tell me about the pregnancy," I said gently. "Tell me what it was like to discover you were pregnant again, what you felt when you realized you couldn't afford another child, what it was like to make that decision and go through the procedure alone." Lisa looked surprised by the directness of my request, but then she began to talk. Really talk. About the panic she'd felt when she first missed her period, about the sleepless nights she and Daniel had spent trying to figure out how to make their budget work with another child, about the guilt and sadness she'd experienced, even while knowing that ending the pregnancy was the right choice for their family. As she talked, I found myself seeing her as a complete person for the first time, not just Daniel's wife or Sophie's mother, but a woman with her own fears and dreams and impossible choices. I found myself feeling the kind of protective love and concern for her that I'd always wanted to feel, but had never been allowed to express, because she'd never let me close enough to know what she actually needed. "I was so scared during the procedure," she admitted. "Daniel had to work that day. We couldn't afford for him to take time off, so I went alone. I sat in that waiting room surrounded by other women who were dealing with their own difficult situations, and I felt so isolated and ashamed. I kept thinking about you, actually, wondering what you would think of me if you knew what I was doing." "What I would have thought," I said, reaching across the table to take her hand, "is that you were a brave woman making an incredibly difficult decision in impossible circumstances. What I would have done is driven you to that appointment and held your hand in the waiting room and brought you home afterward to recover. What I would have given you is unconditional love and support, exactly the same way I did when Sophie was born." She squeezed my hand and cried in earnest then, deep sobs that seemed to come from years of carrying burdens alone, because she'd convinced herself that asking for help was weakness and that her struggles were too messy for other people to handle. "I'm so tired of pretending everything is fine when it's not," she whispered. "I'm so tired of feeling like I have to be perfect all the time, like I can't let anyone see how much I'm struggling." "You don't have to pretend with me anymore," I told her. "You don't have to be perfect. You don't have to handle everything alone. I'm here, and I want to help, and I promise you that there's nothing you could tell me about your life that would make me love you less." We sat together in my kitchen, holding hands across the table, and I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Genuine connection with someone I loved. Not the performance of connection, not the appearance of family harmony, but real intimacy born of honest communication and mutual vulnerability. But even as I treasured this breakthrough with Lisa, I knew that the larger problem remained unresolved. Daniel hadn't participated in this conversation, hadn't acknowledged his role in creating the family dynamic that had left all of us feeling isolated and misunderstood. And more fundamentally, nothing we'd discussed addressed the pattern of exclusion and exploitation that had characterized my relationship with both of them for years. Lisa's tears and apologies were meaningful, but they didn't change the fact that I'd been systematically undervalued and taken for granted by the people I'd sacrificed everything to support. One honest conversation didn't undo decades of being treated as a resource rather than a person. When Daniel returned home that evening after dropping Sophie at her after-school program, he found Lisa and me sitting at the kitchen table with cups of tea, having what probably looked like a normal, pleasant conversation. He seemed relieved, apparently assuming that whatever crisis the morning had created had been resolved through women's natural tendency to smooth over conflict and restore family harmony. "Everything good here?" he asked casually, already reaching for the mail and checking his phone, his attention divided among multiple priorities that clearly ranked higher than understanding what had actually transpired between his wife and mother. "Daniel," I said firmly, "we need to finish our conversation from this morning." He paused in sorting through bills and advertisements, probably hoping he could deflect whatever was coming with humor or distraction. "Mom, I thought we cleared all that up." Lisa explained about the medical situation and the financial pressures, and you understand now why we had to handle it the way we did. No, I said quietly. I don't understand. And Lisa didn't explain a medical situation, because there wasn't one. She told me the truth about your financial concerns and your decision-making process, which I appreciate. But that doesn't explain why you felt you couldn't trust me with that information from the beginning. Daniel sat down heavily, the mail forgotten, and I could see him mentally calculating how much of his evening this conversation was going to consume and how quickly he could bring it to a conclusion. Mom, we've been through this. We didn't want to burden you with our problems. We knew you'd want to help, and we couldn't ask you to take on any more than you're already doing for us. Daniel, look at me when I'm talking to you. Something in my tone made him actually meet my eyes instead of looking past me toward the TV or his phone or anywhere else that might offer escape from this uncomfortable moment. For 25 years, I've organized my entire life around supporting you and your goals. I worked 2 jobs to pay for your college tuition. I moved in with you and Lisa when Sophie was born and provided free live-in childcare for 3 months. I babysit every time you need a night out or a weekend away. I buy groceries for your household. I cook meals for your family. I clean your apartment. I provide emergency money when your budget falls short. And I do all of this without being asked because I love you and I want to contribute to your success and happiness. Daniel opened his mouth to respond, but I held up my hand to stop him. In return, you give me polite acknowledgement and access to my granddaughter. You include me in surface-level family activities but exclude me from important decisions and meaningful conversations. You take my labor and my money and my time, but you don't want my input, my advice, or my emotional support. You've created a relationship where I give everything and receive nothing except the privilege of continuing to give more. That's not true, Mom. We appreciate everything you do for us. You know we're grateful. Daniel, gratitude is a feeling. Appreciation is an attitude. What I'm talking about is respect. What I need from you is inclusion and consideration, and the basic acknowledgement that my thoughts and feelings matter enough to be taken into account when decisions are being made that affect our family. He was quiet for a moment, and I could see him trying to process what I was saying in a way that didn't require him to fundamentally examine how he'd been treating me for years. Mom, I don't know what you want me to say. The pregnancy situation was really difficult for us, and we handled it the best way we knew how. I'm sorry if your feelings were hurt, but we can't change what happened. I'm not asking you to change what happened with the pregnancy, Daniel. I'm asking you to change what happens going forward. I'm asking you to start including me in your lives as a person rather than just using me as a service provider. I'm asking you to consider my feelings when you make decisions that affect our family. I'm asking you to treat me with the same respect you'd show any other adult whose help and support you valued. Lisa reached over and touched Daniel's arm. She's right, she said quietly. We've been taking advantage of her generosity for years, and we've been excluding her from our real lives because it was easier than dealing with her opinions or emotions. It's not fair, and it's not how families should treat each other. Daniel looked between his wife and his mother. 2 women he'd apparently never considered might have their own perspectives and needs that deserved consideration alongside his own. I don't know how to do what you're asking, he said finally, and for the first time, his voice held genuine uncertainty rather than defensive dismissal. I don't know how to have the kind of relationship with you that you want. This is how our family has always worked. You take care of everyone, and we let you. That's exactly the problem, I replied. You've been letting me take care of you for so long that you've forgotten I might need care too. You've been accepting my service for so long that you've stopped seeing me as someone who deserves love and respect and consideration in return. But Mom, we do love you. Of course we love you. Daniel, love is not just a feeling. Love is action. Love is consideration. Love is including the people you care about in your life in meaningful ways. When you love someone, you want to know how they're feeling, what they're thinking, what they need. You want to share your struggles with them so they can support you, and you want to support them through their struggles too. I gestured around the kitchen where we'd shared thousands of meals over the years, most of them consumed in polite but shallow conversation about logistics and schedules rather than anything that actually mattered. When was the last time you asked me about my dreams, my fears, my hopes for my future. When was the last time you wanted to know how I was feeling about something important, or whether I was happy with my life, or what I might need from you and Lisa to feel more fulfilled and connected? When was the last time you treated me like a whole person instead of just a grandmother-shaped solution to your childcare and household management problems? Daniel was quiet for a long time, staring at his hands folded on the table. When he finally looked up, his eyes were red with unshed tears. "I don't know," he whispered. "I can't remember the last time I asked you anything like that. I guess I assumed you were happy because you never complained. I assumed your life was basically okay because you always seemed available to help with our problems. I never thought about whether you might have problems of your own, or dreams of your own, or needs that weren't being met. Daniel, I've spent so many years focusing on your needs that I think I forgot I was allowed to have needs of my own. I've been so afraid of losing you and Lisa and Sophie that I convinced myself that being useful was the same thing as being loved, but it's not. And I can't continue in a relationship where I'm valued only for what I provide rather than who I am." The silence that followed was different from the tense quiet of the morning. This was the silence of people processing difficult truths, considering changes that felt overwhelming but necessary. Finally, Lisa spoke up. "What do you need from us? Specifically, I mean. If we want to have the kind of relationship with you that you're describing, what would that look like on a daily basis?" It was such a simple question, but it caught me completely off guard, because nobody had asked me to articulate my needs in so long that I wasn't even sure I knew what they were anymore. "I need to be consulted about decisions that affect our family, even when you ultimately choose not to follow my advice," I said slowly, working through thoughts I'd never been asked to organize before. "I need regular conversations about things that matter, not just logistics and schedules. I need to feel like my emotions and opinions are valued enough to be considered. And I need to know that you want me in your lives because you enjoy my company and value my perspective, not just because I'm convenient." "Those seem like reasonable requests," Daniel said, though he looked somewhat overwhelmed by the prospect of fundamentally changing how our family operated. "They're not requests, Daniel. They're requirements. I'm 72 years old, and I don't have unlimited time left to spend in relationships that don't nourish me. I've given you the best years of my life, and I need the remaining years to be more than just continued service to people who don't really see me as a person." The words felt revolutionary coming out of my mouth. I'd never made demands on my family before, never insisted that my needs be prioritized alongside theirs, never suggested that my contribution to their lives should be reciprocated with genuine care and consideration. "Mom," Daniel said carefully, "what are you saying exactly? Are you threatening to cut us off if we don't change how we treat you?" "I'm saying that I deserve better than what I've been accepting, and I'm no longer willing to pretend otherwise. I'm saying that if you want me to continue being part of your life, it needs to be as a valued family member, not just as unpaid help. I'm saying that love without respect is not actually love, and I won't settle for less than both anymore." Lisa reached over and took my hand again. "Margaret, you're absolutely right. We've been treating you terribly, and we've been taking your love and support for granted. I want to do better. I want us to have a real relationship, and I want Daniel and me to be better family to you." "I want that too," Daniel said, though his voice held more uncertainty than conviction. "I just don't know how to change patterns that have been in place for my entire adult life. I don't know how to be a different kind of son than I've always been." "You start by making different choices," I said simply. "You start by asking different questions. You start by considering my feelings when you make decisions. You start by including me in conversations instead of talking around me. You start by treating our relationship as something valuable that requires care and attention, not just something that exists automatically because we're related." Over the following days, things did begin to change, though slowly and sometimes awkwardly. Daniel made an effort to have real conversations with me about work stress and financial worries. Lisa started sharing details about her friendships and her struggles with feeling isolated as a working mother. They asked for my opinion about decisions ranging from Sophie's extracurricular activities to whether they should look for a larger apartment. But more importantly, they began to ask about me, about my health, my loneliness, my memories of their father, my dreams for retirement, my feelings about aging. For the first time in decades, I felt seen and heard and valued for more than just the services I provided. The shift wasn't perfect or complete. Daniel still sometimes reverted to his old patterns of taking my availability for granted, and Lisa still occasionally seemed surprised when I offered opinions that differed from what she expected. But there was genuine effort being made, and I could feel the difference in our daily interactions. However, even as individual relationships improved, I was becoming increasingly aware of how much of my own life I'd sacrificed to maintain my role as the family's primary support system. I'd spent so many years defining myself through my usefulness to others that I barely knew who I was when I wasn't cooking, cleaning, babysitting, or solving other people's problems. One afternoon, while Sophie was at school and Daniel and Lisa were at work, I found myself alone in my apartment for the first time in months, with no specific responsibilities or obligations. The silence felt strange and almost uncomfortable after so many years of constant service and availability. I walked around my small space, really looking at it for the first time in ages. The walls were decorated with photos of Daniel, Lisa, and Sophie, their graduations, their wedding, Sophie's school pictures. But there were almost no images that reflected my own interests, achievements, or relationships outside of my family role. My closet was full of practical clothes suitable for cooking and cleaning and chasing after an 8-year-old, but nothing that made me feel attractive or confident or like my own person. My bookshelves held children's stories I'd collected for Sophie and reference books about child development and household management, but nothing that reflected my own intellectual curiosity or personal interests. I realized that somewhere along the line, I'd erased myself in service of my family. I'd become so focused on meeting their needs that I'd stopped nurturing any needs of my own. I'd become so invested in their success and happiness that I'd forgotten to consider what might make me successful and happy as an individual. That evening, when Daniel came home from work, I was sitting at the kitchen table with a notebook and pen, making lists. "What are you working on, Mom?" he asked. And I was pleased to notice that he actually seemed interested in my answer, rather than just making polite conversation. "I'm trying to remember who I used to be before I became defined entirely by my role in this family," I said. "I'm making lists of things I used to enjoy, dreams I used to have, interests I abandoned over the years to focus on taking care of everyone else." He sat down across from me, genuine curiosity on his face. "What kinds of things?" "Well, I used to love reading novels, especially historical fiction. I wanted to travel, maybe take some art classes. I used to think about finishing my nursing degree someday. I had friends at work that I lost touch with when I retired because I was so busy helping you and Lisa with Sophie." Daniel looked at my lists, filled with possibilities that had nothing to do with his household or his needs or his family's logistics. "Why did you stop doing those things?" he asked. "Because there wasn't time. Because every spare moment I had was needed for something related to helping you build your life. Because I convinced myself that your happiness was more important than my own fulfillment." "Mom," he said quietly, "I never asked you to give up your own life for mine. No, you didn't ask, but you accepted it. When I offered to sacrifice my interests for yours, you let me. When I made myself available for constant service, you took advantage of that availability. When I stopped talking about my own dreams and focused entirely on supporting yours, you stopped thinking of me as someone who might have dreams worth supporting." We sat there looking at my lists, pages of possibilities for a life that had been dormant for decades. And I think we both realized how much had been lost in the process of building the family dynamic we'd all grown accustomed to. "What would you need from me and Lisa to start reclaiming some of these interests?" Daniel asked, and I was moved by the genuine concern in his voice. "I'd need to know that it's okay for me to sometimes say no when you need help, so I can use that time for my own pursuits. I'd need to know that my value in this family doesn't depend entirely on my availability and usefulness. I'd need support for spending money on classes or activities for myself, instead of automatically using any extra funds to help with your expenses. Those seem like reasonable requests," he said, echoing Lisa's words from our earlier conversation. "Again, Daniel, they're not requests. They're requirements for me to continue investing my limited remaining time and energy in relationships that need to nourish me as much as I nourish them. Over the following weeks, I began to reclaim small pieces of my identity. I enrolled in a watercolor painting class at the community center in Elmhurst. I joined a book club that met at the Queens Public Library. I reconnected with Maria Santos, a former colleague who'd been inviting me to lunch for years while I made excuses about being too busy with family responsibilities. Each of these activities represented a radical act of self-care after decades of selfless service. Every Tuesday evening I spent at art class was 2 hours I wasn't available to babysit or cook dinner. Every Thursday afternoon I reserved for book club was time I couldn't use to run errands for Daniel and Lisa. Every Saturday I spent having lunch with Maria was a day I wasn't managing someone else's household or solving someone else's problems. At first, the guilt was overwhelming. I'd trained myself so thoroughly to prioritize everyone else's needs that taking time for my own interests felt selfish and irresponsible. But gradually, as I remembered what it felt like to engage my mind with challenging books, to create something beautiful with my hands, to have conversations with peers who knew me as Margaret the person rather than Margaret the grandmother, I began to understand what I'd been missing. More surprisingly, my new pursuits seemed to have a positive effect on my relationships with my family as well. When I had less time available for managing their day-to-day logistics, they stepped up and handled more things themselves. When I had interesting experiences and accomplishments to share, our conversations became more balanced and engaging. When I was fulfilled by activities outside our family dynamic, I was less resentful of the energy I chose to invest in supporting them. But true change requires testing. And that test came about 2 months after our kitchen table confrontations, when Daniel called me with a request that would have been automatic in the old version of our relationship. Mom, Lisa and I have a chance to go to a wedding in California next weekend. It's one of her college friends, and it would mean a lot to her to be there. Could you watch Sophie for the weekend? In the past, I would have immediately checked my calendar and rearranged anything that conflicted with their needs. I would have said yes before even finding out the details about dates, times, or what the weekend would require of me. This time I paused. When is the wedding, and what would watching Sophie involve? It's next Saturday and Sunday. We'd fly out Friday evening and come back Sunday night. Sophie could stay at your place, or you could stay here. Whatever works better for you. I looked at my calendar, where I'd started documenting my own commitments and activities with the same care I'd once reserved for tracking everyone else's schedules. The proposed weekend included my book club's annual volunteer day at the Queens Botanical Garden, an event I'd been looking forward to for weeks. Daniel, I can't do it that weekend. I have plans on Saturday that I don't want to cancel. There was silence on the other end of the phone, and I could practically hear him processing this unprecedented response to his request for help. What kind of plans? He asked, and I could detect the familiar assumption that whatever I had going on couldn't possibly be as important as what he needed. I'm volunteering with my book club at the Botanical Garden. We're helping with their fall planting project, and they're counting on me to be there. Another pause. Mom, can't you just skip it this once? This wedding is really important to Lisa, and we can't afford to pay for a babysitter for the whole weekend. There it was, the old pattern asserting itself. My commitments didn't matter. My plans were automatically less important than theirs, and I was expected to sacrifice my interests to solve their problems. No, Daniel, I can't skip it. I made a commitment to my book club, and they're counting on my participation. If this weekend is the only opportunity for you to attend the wedding, you'll need to find another solution. Mom, I don't understand. You love spending time with Sophie, and you always help us when we need it. Why is this different? This is different because I'm no longer organizing my entire life around your convenience. I'm different because I've remembered that I'm a person with interests and commitments that matter too. I'm happy to help you when I can, but I'm not available for automatic sacrifice anymore. The conversation that followed was tense and difficult. Daniel tried several approaches: guilt, manipulation, appeals to my love for Sophie, reminders of everything he and Lisa had been dealing with. But for the first time in my adult life, I held firm to my own boundaries. Daniel, I love you and Lisa and Sophie more than I can express. But I also love myself enough now to insist that my life has value beyond my usefulness to your family. Find another solution for this weekend, or decide that the wedding isn't as important as you initially thought. But don't ask me to give up something meaningful to me just because it's easier than finding alternatives. In the end, they decided not to attend the wedding. Lisa was disappointed, but she also told me later that she respected my position and understood why I couldn't automatically drop my plans to accommodate theirs. More importantly, the incident established a new precedent in our relationship. I was no longer the infinitely available resource I'd been for decades. I was a family member with my own life, my own commitments, and my own priorities that deserved consideration alongside everyone else's. This shift required Daniel and Lisa to develop skills they'd never needed before: finding alternative childcare, managing their household responsibilities without my automatic assistance, making decisions about their social commitments based on their actual resources rather than assuming I'd fill any gaps. But it also meant that when I chose to help them, it was because I wanted to contribute to their lives rather than because I felt obligated or taken for granted. The help I provided came from love and choice rather than habit and expectation. As I settled into this new version of myself and my relationships, I thought the hardest part was behind us. We'd had the difficult conversations, established new boundaries, and begun building more balanced family dynamics. I was painting watercolors twice a week, reading books that challenged and inspired me, spending time with friends who knew me as a multifaceted person rather than just a family caretaker. But then came the test I hadn't expected, the revelation that showed me just how deeply the old patterns had been ingrained and how far we still had to go. It was a Thursday afternoon in November. I was at home preparing for book club when my phone buzzed with a text message from a number I didn't recognize. When I opened it, I found a screenshot of a Facebook post that made my stomach drop to the floor. The post was from Lisa's account, shared in a local parenting group with thousands of members. It read, "Need advice dealing with overbearing in-laws who don't respect boundaries. My MIL has become increasingly demanding and selfish since we asked her to be less involved in our family decisions. She started refusing to help with childcare and gets upset when we don't include her in every aspect of our lives. How do you handle family members who make everything about themselves?" Below the post were dozens of comments offering advice, most of it along the lines of, "Cut toxic people out of your life," and "You don't owe family members who make you feel guilty about setting boundaries." I read the post 3 times before the full impact hit me. Lisa had taken our private family struggles and presented them to strangers as a story of an unreasonable older woman making demands on a long-suffering young family. She'd portrayed my boundaries as selfishness, my request for respect as being overbearing, my refusal to provide unlimited free service as some kind of manipulation. But worse than the public humiliation was the realization that this was how she actually saw our situation. Despite all our conversations, despite her apparent understanding and agreement that changes needed to be made in how our family treated each other, she still fundamentally viewed me as someone whose role was to provide service and whose requests for consideration were unreasonable impositions. The screenshot had come from Maria, my neighbor, who'd seen the post and recognized enough details to know Lisa was writing about me. "I thought you should know about this," her accompanying text read. "I'm sorry, Margaret. You don't deserve this kind of betrayal." I sat in my small living room, surrounded by the art supplies and books that represented my newfound sense of self, and felt something shift inside me. This wasn't just another misunderstanding that could be resolved with honest conversation. This was a fundamental revelation about how I was perceived by people I'd spent decades loving and supporting. Lisa had presented our family's situation to hundreds of strangers as a story with herself as the victim and me as the problem. She'd sought validation from people who didn't know me, didn't know our history, didn't understand the decades of sacrifice and service I'd provided to help build the life she now wanted to protect from my supposedly unreasonable demands. The comments were particularly painful to read. Stranger after stranger advised Lisa to set firm boundaries with me, to not let guilt control her decisions, to prioritize her own family's needs over her in-laws' feelings. They praised her for finally standing up for herself and assured her that she didn't owe me anything just because I was family. What none of these well-meaning internet advisors knew was that I'd never asked for anything I hadn't already given tenfold. I'd never made demands that weren't rooted in decades of proven devotion to this family's well-being. I'd never asked to be prioritized over Lisa's own family. I'd only asked to be treated as if I was part of that family too. But in Lisa's telling, I was the unreasonable one. I was the problem that needed to be managed rather than the person who deserved love and respect. I screenshot the post and its comments, not because I planned to confront Lisa with them, but because I needed evidence of what I was actually dealing with. I needed proof that the changes I thought we'd made were more superficial than substantial, and that the old patterns of dismissal and exploitation were still alive and well beneath a thin veneer of improved communication. That evening, when Daniel and Lisa came home, I was waiting in the kitchen with my phone and a cup of tea. I'd spent hours deciding how to handle this betrayal, and I'd concluded that directness was the only approach that made sense. "Lisa," I said calmly, "we need to talk about the Facebook post you made about our family situation." Her face went completely white, and she looked at Daniel with the kind of panic that confirmed she knew exactly what I was referring to. "Margaret, she started, then stopped, apparently realizing there was no way to deny or explain away what she'd done. "You took our private family struggles and presented them to strangers as a story about an overbearing mother-in-law who doesn't respect boundaries," I continued, my voice steady despite the hurt and anger coursing through me. "You asked hundreds of people for advice on how to handle someone you portrayed as selfish and demanding, without giving them any context about our actual relationship or history." Daniel looked confused and concerned. "What Facebook post? Lisa, what is she talking about?" I handed him my phone so he could read the post and comments for himself. As he scrolled through the responses, I watched his expression change from confusion to shock to something that looked like disappointment. "Lisa, why would you do this?" he asked. "Why would you put our family business online like this?" "I was frustrated," she said defensively. "I needed advice from other people who dealt with similar situations. I didn't use anyone's names or specific details." "You didn't need to use names," I replied. "You provided enough details that anyone who knows our family would recognize the situation. Maria saw this post and immediately knew you were writing about me. How many other people in our community do you think read this and connected it to our family?" "I'm sorry," Lisa said, though her tone suggested she was more sorry about being caught than about what she'd done. "I was just looking for support and perspective from other people." "What kind of support were you looking for exactly?" "Support for continuing to treat me like a service provider rather than a family member. Validation that my requests for basic respect and consideration were unreasonable. Permission to dismiss my feelings and needs because they inconvenience you." She couldn't answer, because we all knew that's exactly what she'd been seeking. She'd wanted strangers to tell her that she was right to resist the changes I'd asked for, that she was justified in viewing my boundaries as selfishness, that she didn't owe me the kind of consideration and inclusion I'd been requesting. "Lisa," I said, "this post tells me that despite all our conversations, despite your apologies and promises to do better, you still fundamentally see me as someone whose role is to serve your family without expecting anything meaningful in return. You still think my requests for respect and inclusion are unreasonable impositions rather than basic human needs." Daniel was still reading through the comments, and I could see him processing not just what Lisa had written, but how complete strangers had responded to her portrayal of our situation. "Mom," he said finally, "I had no idea Lisa felt this way about the changes we've been trying to make. I thought we were all on the same page about treating you better and including you more in our lives." "Apparently we weren't," I replied. "Apparently at least one of us was just going through the motions of improvement while secretly seeking validation for maintaining the old patterns." The conversation that followed was unlike any we'd had before. This wasn't about misunderstandings or communication problems. This was about fundamental differences in how we viewed relationships, respect, and family obligations. Lisa tried several approaches to minimize what she'd done. She claimed the post was taken out of context, that she'd been having a bad day, that she'd deleted it as soon as she realized it was inappropriate. But the screenshots I had showed that the post had been up for hours, accumulating dozens of responses that she'd actively engaged with rather than shutting down. More telling than her excuses were her attempts to turn the situation around on me. She suggested that my reaction to the post proved I was indeed being overly sensitive. She implied that my hurt feelings were disproportionate to what she'd done. She argued that everyone needed outlets to vent their frustrations, as if I was being unreasonable to expect that those outlets wouldn't involve publicly humiliating me to hundreds of strangers. "Lisa," I said finally, "this isn't about your right to seek advice or support from friends. This is about your decision to characterize our family situation in a way that completely misrepresents my role in your lives and paints me as a problem to be managed rather than a person to be loved. But Margaret, you have been demanding lately. You have been less flexible about helping us when we need it. You have been asking to be included in decisions that don't really concern you. Stop." I held up my hand, and something in my tone made both of them go quiet. "Lisa, listen to yourself. You just described my requests for basic respect and consideration as demands. You characterized my refusal to provide unlimited free service as being less flexible. You dismissed my desire to be included in family decisions as asking for involvement in things that don't really concern me." I stood up from the table and looked at both of them. These two people I'd loved and sacrificed for and centered my life around for so many years. This conversation has shown me that fundamentally nothing has changed. You may have learned to have more polite conversations with me, but you still see me as someone whose primary purpose is to make your lives easier. You still think my needs and feelings are secondary to your convenience. You still believe that love flows in only one direction in this family, from me to you, and that wanting anything in return makes me selfish and demanding. The silence that followed was different from any we'd shared before. This wasn't the quiet of people processing difficult truths or working through misunderstandings. This was the silence of people realizing that they'd been fundamentally incompatible all along, but had been too comfortable with the existing arrangement to notice. "Margaret," Daniel said finally, "what do you want us to do? How do we fix this?" "Daniel, I don't think this can be fixed. Not really. Because fixing it would require both of you to completely change how you think about me, our relationship, and what family means. It would require you to see me as someone whose happiness matters as much as your own, whose needs deserve consideration equal to yours, whose love and support should be reciprocated rather than just accepted." I walked to the window and looked out at Roosevelt Avenue, where people were going about their evening routines, walking dogs, returning from work, picking up groceries for dinner. Normal people living normal lives where relationships were built on mutual care and consideration rather than exploitation disguised as family devotion. "I've spent 72 years learning to love other people better than I love myself," I said, still facing the window. "I've spent decades believing that making myself smaller would somehow make the people I care about bigger and happier. I've convinced myself that being useful was the same thing as being valued, that providing service was equivalent to receiving love." I turned back to face them, and for the first time in my adult life, I felt completely calm in the face of family conflict. Not resigned, not defeated, but peaceful in the way that comes from finally understanding something clearly. But Lisa's Facebook post has shown me that no amount of service will ever earn me the respect and consideration I deserve from people who fundamentally see me as a resource rather than a person. No amount of sacrifice will ever convince you to value my feelings and needs if you don't already believe they matter. "Mom," Daniel said, his voice shaking slightly, "are you saying you're cutting us out of your life?" "I'm saying that I'm no longer available to play the role you've assigned me in this family. I'm no longer available to provide unlimited support while receiving minimal consideration in return. I'm no longer willing to accept crumbs of affection and call it love." Lisa started to cry then, though I wasn't sure whether her tears were from sadness or frustration or fear about what my decision might mean practically for their family logistics. "Margaret, please don't do this. Sophie needs you. We need you. I'm sorry about the Facebook post. I really am. I'll delete it right now and apologize publicly if that's what you want." "Lisa, this isn't about the Facebook post anymore. The post just showed me something I needed to see about how you really view our relationship. Deleting it won't change the fact that after months of conversations about respect and inclusion, your first instinct when frustrated was to seek validation for treating me as a problem rather than working with me to find solutions. But what about Sophie? Daniel asked, playing what he clearly thought was his strongest card. You can't punish her for our mistakes. She loves you, and she needs her grandmother in her life. Sophie deserves to grow up seeing healthy relationship models, I replied. She deserves to see what it looks like when people treat each other with mutual respect and consideration. She deserves to see her grandmother valued as a whole person, not just used as convenient help. If she grows up watching me accept disrespectful treatment from people who claim to love me, what will that teach her about what she should accept in her own relationships? This was perhaps the most difficult decision I'd ever made, but it was also the clearest. I couldn't continue participating in a family dynamic that required me to minimize myself for other people's comfort. I couldn't keep modeling unconditional service to a granddaughter who needed to learn that love should be reciprocal and that everyone deserves basic respect. I'm not disappearing from Sophie's life completely, I continued, but our relationship will need to look different going forward. I'll see her on occasions when you can treat me with the respect due to any adult whose love and support you value. I'll spend time with her when it's about genuine family connection rather than convenient childcare. But I won't continue to be available for automatic service to people who see my boundaries as selfishness and my needs as inconvenience. What followed were several hours of what felt like negotiations, with Daniel and Lisa alternately pleading, arguing, making promises, and trying various forms of emotional manipulation to get me to return to my previous role in their lives. But something fundamental had shifted in me. That Facebook post had been the final proof I needed that the changes I thought we'd made were superficial at best. Lisa's immediate instinct when frustrated had been to seek validation for viewing me as unreasonable, rather than examining whether her expectations might be inappropriate. For the first time in my life, I held firm to boundaries that required other people to change their behavior, rather than asking me to change mine. For the first time, I insisted that their love for me be demonstrated through actions and consideration, not just words and occasional appreciation. The conversation ended without resolution, which was actually exactly what I needed. I didn't need them to understand my position or agree with my decisions. I just needed to stop participating in relationships that required me to be less than whole in order for other people to be comfortable. Over the following days, I continued with my new routines: painting class, book club, lunches with Maria, while Daniel and Lisa presumably figured out how to manage their household and childcare without assuming my automatic availability. Daniel called several times, sometimes angry and demanding, sometimes sad and pleading, always focused on how my boundaries were affecting them rather than trying to understand why I'd needed to establish them in the first place. Lisa sent a long text message apologizing again for the Facebook post and promising to do better. But her apologies were still focused on my reaction rather than her actions. She was sorry I'd been hurt, sorry there had been a misunderstanding, sorry things had gotten complicated, but she never acknowledged that publicly characterizing me as an overbearing problem had been a betrayal of trust that revealed fundamental disrespect. But it was Sophie's reaction that tested my resolve most severely. When she learned that I wouldn't be available for daily childcare anymore, that our time together would be scheduled rather than assumed, that I was building a life that didn't revolve entirely around her family's needs, she was confused and hurt. "Grandma Margaret, why don't you want to take care of me anymore?" she asked during one of our scheduled visits, her 8-year-old directness cutting straight to the heart of my deepest fears about this decision. "Sophie, I will always want to take care of you," I assured her. "But I also need to take care of myself. And I need your parents to take care of me too. Growing up means learning that all the people we love are whole persons who deserve respect and consideration, not just people who exist to make our lives easier." It was a complicated conversation for a child, but Sophie was smart and observant. She'd watched the family dynamics play out for years, seen how I was treated versus how other adults in her life were treated. "Are you mad at Mommy and Daddy?" she asked. "I'm sad that they've forgotten how to treat me like someone they love instead of just someone they use," I told her honestly. "But I'm not mad. I'm just choosing to spend my time with people who remember that I'm a person who deserves kindness and respect. These conversations with Sophie were heartbreaking but necessary. She needed to understand that love requires mutual care, that healthy relationships involve consideration for everyone involved, and that even grandmothers have feelings and needs that matter. More importantly, I realized that by accepting poor treatment from her parents for so many years, I'd been teaching Sophie that love meant accepting whatever people were willing to give you, even when it wasn't enough. I'd been modeling the idea that older people, and women especially, existed primarily to serve others rather than being worthy of care and consideration themselves. By establishing boundaries that required her parents to treat me with respect, I was teaching Sophie what healthy relationships looked like. I was showing her that she deserved to be valued for who she was, not just what she could provide, and that she should never accept treatment that made her feel invisible or taken for granted. The weeks that followed were among the loneliest of my life, but they were also among the most peaceful. Without the constant demands of managing other people's emergencies and logistics, I had time to read entire books, to experiment with watercolor techniques that challenged me, to have long conversations with friends who enjoyed my company, rather than just needing my services. I realized that I'd become so accustomed to the stress of constant availability that I'd forgotten what it felt like to wake up in the morning without immediately calculating what other people needed from me. I'd become so used to organizing my days around other people's schedules that I'd forgotten the luxury of making plans based on my own interests and energy levels. For the first time in decades, I was living my own life rather than existing as a supporting character in other people's stories. But the real test of my transformation came about a month after our final confrontation, when Lisa called me in what sounded like genuine crisis. "Margaret," she said, her voice shaking with tears, "I need help. Daniel is in the hospital with appendicitis. They're saying he needs emergency surgery, and I don't have anyone to watch Sophie while I'm there with him. My parents are in Florida, and I don't have money for a babysitter for what might be days. I know you're angry with us, but please, Sophie needs you." In the old version of our relationship, I would have dropped everything and rushed over without even considering my own plans or needs. I would have taken care of the emergency first and worried about our unresolved issues later. But this time, I paused. I checked my calendar, considered my own emotional capacity for dealing with family drama while managing a frightened child, and thought carefully about what kind of help I could provide that would be genuinely beneficial for everyone involved. "Lisa," I said finally, "I'm sorry to hear about Daniel's condition, and of course I want to help with Sophie during this emergency. But I need us to be clear about the terms of my help, so there are no misunderstandings about what this means for our ongoing relationship." "Terms?" she repeated, sounding surprised that I wasn't immediately offering unconditional assistance. "I'll take care of Sophie during Daniel's hospital stay because she's my granddaughter and she needs support during a scary time. But this is emergency help, not a return to our previous arrangement. When Daniel recovers, we'll go back to the boundaries I established. My helping you now doesn't mean I'm available for regular childcare or that we've resolved our larger relationship issues." There was a pause, and I could hear Lisa processing this response that was so different from what she'd expected and become accustomed to over the years. "I understand," she said finally. "And Margaret, thank you. I know things have been difficult between us, but I'm grateful that you're willing to help Sophie even when you're upset with Daniel and me." That conversation marked a turning point in how our family operated. Lisa and Daniel began to distinguish between emergency situations where family rallies together to help each other and routine demands for service that had been dressed up as love and togetherness. They learned to plan for childcare rather than assuming I'd always be available. They developed backup systems for household management that didn't depend on my constant input. They found ways to manage their budget and logistics that treated my contributions as generous gifts rather than expected provisions. Most importantly, when they did ask for help, they approached it as requests rather than assumptions, and they showed genuine gratitude rather than casual acknowledgement. During Daniel's recovery, I spent a week caring for Sophie while Lisa managed work and hospital visits. But instead of falling back into old patterns, we maintained new boundaries. I helped because I wanted to contribute during a difficult time, Not because I felt obligated to solve all their problems. I provided care for Sophie that was focused on her emotional needs during a scary situation, not on managing everyone else's logistics. And when Daniel came home from the hospital, instead of immediately resuming my role as household manager and childcare provider, I returned to my own life and routines while remaining available for genuine family connection. The difference was subtle, but profound. I was choosing my involvement based on my own emotional availability and their actual needs, rather than automatically providing whatever service they requested, regardless of the impact on my own life and well-being. This shift required all of us to develop new skills. Daniel and Lisa had to become more self-reliant and better at planning ahead. I had to learn to evaluate requests based on my own capacity and boundaries, rather than automatically saying yes to everything. Sophie had to adjust to seeing her grandmother as a person with her own life, rather than someone who existed solely to make her life more convenient. But the relationships that emerged from this difficult transition were stronger and more honest than what we'd had before. When we spent time together, it was because we genuinely enjoyed each other's company, rather than because roles and obligations required it. When I helped with practical matters, it was appreciated as a gift, rather than expected as a duty. When they included me in decisions and conversations, it was because they valued my perspective, rather than because I demanded consideration. Looking back now, 6 months after that pharmacy receipt changed everything, I can see that the crisis we went through was necessary for all of us to grow into more authentic versions of ourselves. Daniel had to learn that love requires action, not just feeling. He had to develop the ability to see me as a whole person, with needs and feelings that mattered, not just as a resource for solving his family's practical problems. He had to understand that taking advantage of someone's generosity, even when they offer it freely, can damage relationships in ways that polite appreciation can't repair. Lisa had to confront her assumptions about family obligations, and her tendency to seek validation for avoiding difficult relationship work, rather than doing the hard work of genuine connection. She had to learn that love means considering other people's feelings when making decisions, even when that consideration is inconvenient or challenging. I had to learn that my worth wasn't dependent on my usefulness to other people, that setting boundaries was not selfish but necessary, and that teaching people how to treat me with respect was actually a gift to them as well as to myself. Most importantly, I had to understand that love without respect is not actually love, and that accepting poor treatment from people who claim to care about me teaches them that I don't believe I deserve better. The process was painful and sometimes lonely, but it led to relationships based on mutual care and consideration, rather than exploitation disguised as family devotion. These days, when Daniel calls to check on me, it's because he wants to know how I'm feeling, what I'm reading, how my art classes are going. When Lisa shares details about her work or friendships, it's because she values my perspective and enjoys our conversation. When I spend time with Sophie, it's because we genuinely enjoy each other's company, and she's learning that all relationships should be built on mutual care and respect. I still help my family when they need support, but now it's because I choose to contribute to their lives rather than because I feel obligated to solve their problems. They've learned to manage their own logistics and plan for their own needs, so when they do ask for help, it's for genuine emergencies or special occasions rather than routine convenience. The apartment where I spend my days is still small and sometimes creaky, but it's filled with evidence of my own interests and accomplishments. Watercolor paintings I'm proud of, books that have challenged and inspired me, photos from lunches with friends who know me as a complete person rather than just someone's grandmother. When I wake up in the morning, I make my coffee in the same chipped mug, but now I plan my day based on my own interests and energy rather than immediately calculating what other people need from me. I check in with family members because I care about them, not because I'm responsible for managing their lives. The sounds of Queens outside my window, the A train rumbling past, the vendors on Roosevelt Avenue, the children playing in the street, are the same as they've always been, but now they're the soundtrack to my own life, rather than the background noise to a life spent in service to others. I think about that pharmacy receipt sometimes, that small piece of paper that shattered my illusions about my place in my family, but ultimately led me to a much more authentic and sustainable way of living and loving. The grandchild I thought I was excited about never existed, but in letting go of that fantasy, I discovered a relationship with my actual granddaughter that's based on genuine connection rather than assumed obligation. The family I thought I was part of turned out to be more like an employment arrangement, but in acknowledging that truth, I opened space for real family relationships built on mutual respect and consideration. The life I'd been living, centered entirely around other people's needs and happiness, was unsustainable and ultimately damaging to everyone involved. But the life I'm living now, balanced between caring for others and caring for myself, has room for the kind of love that nourishes everyone it touches. Sometimes people ask me if I regret the decision to establish boundaries with my family, if I miss the closeness we used to have. But I recognize now that what I thought was closeness was actually enmeshment, and what I thought was love was actually codependency. The relationships I have with Daniel, Lisa, and Sophie now are smaller in terms of daily involvement, but larger in terms of genuine connection. We spend less time together, but the time we spend is more meaningful. I provide less service, but the help I offer is more appreciated. I have less influence over their daily logistics, but more input into decisions that actually matter. And for the first time in my adult life, I have relationships that nourish me as much as I nourish them. If you've been listening to my story and recognizing patterns in your own life, if you've been feeling taken for granted by people who claim to love you, if you've been sacrificing your own needs and dreams to make other people's lives more convenient, I want you to know that it's never too late to change these dynamics. Setting boundaries with people you love is one of the most difficult things you'll ever do, but it's also one of the most important. Teaching people to treat you with respect isn't selfish. It's necessary for building relationships that can sustain both people over time. You deserve to be valued for who you are, not just what you can provide. You deserve to have your feelings and needs considered alongside everyone else's. You deserve love that shows up as action, not just words. Have you ever found yourself in a situation where you realized you were giving everything and receiving very little in return? Have you ever had to choose between being used by people you love and demanding the respect you deserve? I'd love to hear your story in the comments below. And if this video has helped you see your own relationships more clearly, please like and subscribe. Your support helps me continue sharing these difficult but important truths, and together we can create a community where everyone knows they deserve better than crumbs and calls them love.